In The Death of DACA, Stefan asks a question that comes up in my life often when discussing the topic of America as a nation, culture, and government with anyone. Do children inherit things their parents obtained illegally? Stef goes on to say, do Bernie Madoffs children get to keep the profits of his Ponzi scheme? Well, no, I mean, it all has to go back. I'd like to ask Stef, who truly owns America? The reason the answer to this question is important to me is that when discussing this topic in my personal life, I often find myself unclear of how the European colonist settlers have a valid claim to America when they acquired the land through initiating coercion against the indigenous people who were already here. I believe that clarifying the truth on this matter will help bring unity between individuals and create a greater incentive to refrain from using the force of government to resolve the cultural and political conflicts that are still present in our society. On a personal level, it'll give me more confidence when facing the aggression and hostility that this topic can manifest when I'm debating the subject. That's from Afton.
Hey Afton, how you doing tonight?
I'm very well. Thank you so much for having me on the show, Stef.
My pleasure, my pleasure. So you're very concerned about one culture taking over another culture or expanding aggressively?
I definitely find that intimidating, but more so I'm wondering if the people who are defined by American culture have any true claim to the land that America was built on. I did a little bit of research and I discovered that the population of the indigenous people that were here initially was primarily wiped out by influenza and other illnesses that were introduced by the Europeans. But of course that was not necessarily intentional. So
it was not
I'm
intentional.
Not sure. Right.
There was
so
no germ theory until the late 19th century.
Yes. So in that case, it was an indirect thing. But I wonder if simply because of the fact that a massive number of people were wiped out, if the surviving members of that culture sort of lost the claim to the land that was forfeited with the death of people. Do you think that there's sort of a collective ownership of America, or if that's possible?
Well, okay, so you're criticizing white people, as if white people were the only people to expand throughout human history. Is that right?
No.
Because this is, I mean, to just tell you, it's kind of boring and repetitive, and I'm not criticizing you. This is just something that's bubbling around in my brain. It's just kind of boring and repetitive that everybody fixates on colonialism and on the indigenous American experience and so on. You know, Islam has been a very expansionist ideology since its origins and has expanded often quite violently, but nobody seems to really talk about that. Everybody kind of gravitates to the exact same group and basically the two or two and a half examples. White Western European males expanding into the New World and white Western males and slavery. Now, as far as the treatment of the indigenous population goes, it was not a genocide. They did not wipe them out intentionally. They tried to negotiate and to navigate with them, and they created treaties, and at one point significant portions of the United States were divvied up and given to the natives, and then they sold them and ended up, you know, they had problems with alcohol for various genetic reasons. There continued to be reservations. There continues to be massive payouts. And you try and find me any conquering tribe in human history. Look at how the Muslims took over Pakistan or India. Look at Genghis Khan, for God's sakes. Look at how the Bantus, which came from the north part of Africa and then ended up in the southern part of Africa, wiping out the indigenous population there. So I just find it interesting that of all of the expansions in human history, you pick in many ways the least aggressive, the most gentle, the most negotiated with, where the most payouts are still occurring. And you kind of overleap every other brutal, unacknowledged expansion in human history. And I'm just kind of wondering why. It seems a little unfair. Also, you're picking on the nicest group, the group that is the most self-critical, which seems kind of bullying, in my opinion.
Well, I completely understand why that would be frustrating for you. I think the reason that I'm interested in the European colonization of America is because I'm from Canada. I was born in Canada. And I also agree that, European societies, Western societies, are relatively peaceful to other societies. Many indigenous cultures base their laws and customs on metaphysics, and of course in the Middle East that is also the case, and it's very dangerous. But the issue is that when I speak to people about Canadian culture, for example, a lot of the time there's this criticism that Canada was stolen from the indigenous people, and the Europeans and the British came here and, tortured people and made them sick and wiped them out and put them on these reservations, and that in terms of the concept of reparations, eventually we should give, I suppose, the control of the resources in the country to indigenous people. And I just find that really confusing. And when I do argue the issue, I often say that there was definitely some aggression involved initially when the British came here and decided to conquer Canada. But the way that our society functions now is very peaceful, and I'm not really sure what Canada would look like if we just, I don't know, went back to Europe, or I'm trying to figure out if we have a valid claim to the land. As far as I could research, like after all of the indigenous people in America were sort of wiped out.
No. They weren't all wiped out. What are you even talking about? They weren't wiped out.
Well, the majority of the population was wiped out by illness, were they not?
Sure, but I mean, they died from illness. Inadvertently died from illness through no ill intent on the part of the people who came here. It was not white Europeans who wiped out the indigenous population. There were wars, don't get me wrong, and there was violence on both sides, but there was a war. But so what? There were wars between indigenous populations. They found graves with 500 smashed-in skulls. There was slavery. There was unbelievable violence and torture and rape among the indigenous populations. So if you want to get mad at someone, get mad at the smallpox bug, right? Get mad at cholera. Get mad. I don't have any understanding as to what it means to say that some vast immorality. The tribes themselves were constantly expanding and rubbing up against each other, and Indian wars, as they were called, and native indigenous wars, were constant, omnipresent. So they had no problem using violence to expand their own territory, to go and take slaves, to go and rape women. So I don't quite understand where it's like, well, there was this harmony, this beautiful paradise, and then these evil Westerners came along with their smallpox blankets and wiped everyone out.
Right.
I mean, it's just false. It's a false big white guilt button that people hammer because it gets them resources. And I'm concerned that I know you're trying to oppose it and all that, but I'm going to judge a culture by how it acts itself. There were no... That when one Indian tribe conquered another Indian tribe, they didn't pay them massive reparations for 200 years. They didn't give them their own sectioned area of land. They didn't give them free healthcare and free education. That never happened. They wiped them out. In general, took the women as slaves, murdered the men. I mean, this is what happened. So this is how the world was. And the Europeans were the nicest of all. By far. And so it just seems like the very nicest group throughout all of human history is the only one. And it's like resources. It's like when people say, well, resources were taken from South Africa. What resources? Were they using a lot of oil and uranium and all that? I mean, were they using a lot of that stuff? I don't really think that they were. I think that they were unable to invent the wheel. They had no written language, and they'd never built a 2-story building. So yes, when science, technology, and capitalism came along, then those groups, then the Europeans and others, the Chinese are now doing it in Jamaica and in Africa and other places, they came along and took resources out from under the ground. But I'm going to go out on a limb here, say if your culture is unable to build a 2-story building, they're not going down half a mile to pry out some diamonds. It's just not going to happen. The resources were inaccessible and unavailable to the tribes and all of that at the time. So I am not a big fan of this endless reparations. I think it's incredibly destructive to indigenous communities. And what happens is the money goes to the tribal chieftains in general, and then the tribal chieftains use it to dole out, to buy favors, and it's incredibly destructive to the indigenous populations as a whole. And I think we've got to stop it all. We have to stop it all. And we can't go back in time. There are many people in Canada who had absolutely nothing to do historically with those who took over other countries. There were people in Australia who were forced into prison ships and were sent out as prisoners with a lot of manufactured evidence and false charges and so on. So they were enslaved and used to build Australia. Do they get reparations for having been enslaved? This reparations thing will never end. Will never end. And it's only and forever applied to white Western Christian nations. Nobody goes to Saudi Arabia and says, well, some of your expansionistic stuff was pretty rough and you plowed under a lot of existing tribes and so on in your expansions. It doesn't go that way. So I'm just tired of it. I'm tired of the group who had historically the most benevolence and the highest standards and the most care and concern being the only ones blamed for these kinds of movements in human history. Human history was a fight. It was a battle. And some people lost and some people won. And all of those people are dead. And if we're going to go with reparations, do people get reparations back for all the people who have taken welfare over the past 50 years? That seems to me a little bit... You can find those people. You know how much money they've taken. Can we get reparations back for that? Because that was money taken by force. So I just wanted to point out that it's not your fault. Please understand, I'm not mad at you. I'm just kind of tired of this stuff. Because here's what happens, right? So according to the standard narrative, the evil whiteys came and destroyed all of the indigenous populations, right? So going to another country and stripping it of resources is really bad. Then migrants come in and immigrants come in, illegal immigrants come in and strip resource. But that's blowback, you see? So white people are too bad, right? Too bad. It's really, really bad when white people go to other people's countries and take their resources. Okay, then white people should stop taking high IQ immigrants from third world countries, because that's strip mining very important resources for the continuation of those cultures. So there is a lot of contemporary injustice that is going on in the world that we need to deal with. There are literally hundreds of thousands of slaves on Haiti. Black Lives Matter dealing with that. Does that matter to people who claim that they care so much about injustice? They don't. There are literal open-air slave markets in Libya as a result of Obama and Hillary Clinton's foreign policy. Now, why aren't people going crazy and trying to do something about those present injustices? Oh, they care so much about slavery, care so much about human subjugation. There are literally millions of slaves around the world. A lot of slaves in Islamic countries, some white slaves in Islamic countries. So who is caring about that injustice and why don't they? Well, two reasons. Number one, a lot of these groups don't admit any guilt and will just tell you to fuck off if you try and make it. And number two, there's no way to get resources out of them. Either they have no money or they have money but they have no guilt. If they have no guilt and they have no money, you can't get resources out of them. So this is not morals. This is not ethics. This is not trying to make the world a better place. This is ferocious collective guilt, racist rent-seeking. It is finding the group that is the most self-critical and has the most resources and pounding the guilt button until money comes out. This has nothing to do with virtue. This has everything to do with greed and exploitation of morally sensitive groups. That's all it is. All it is. You know, I've been to these reservations. I've seen what it's like up close. These soft gulags of heavily funded exclusion. It is brutal. I hate what the Canadian government did with the residential program where they stripped children in an effort to assimilate, because, you know, assimilation and integration works really well. They stripped at gunpoint children from their parents in the indigenous communities and tried to raise them as good little white Catholics or Protestants. And it descended into the usual hell of abuse and sexual predation and God knows what. Horrible. Another government program. It is about the transfer of resources to assuage guilt and to bribe potential voters. It is about feeling good, and it is about relieving guilt. And it only gets attached to Christians. Because Christians, oh, whoa, look at all the moral heroes out there in the world, Afton. I'm not putting you in this category. Look at all the moral heroes out there in the world who get on their noble steeds with their lance and their armor. And they say, let us be so brave and so daring as to criticize an entire religion, which is centered around turn the other cheek and forgive your enemies and love your enemies. Oh, look how brave I am. But if people aren't calling out, say, Islam for its violent expansionist tendencies in the past and demanding it pay reparations, and who is, I don't want to hear about Europeans because it's got nothing to do with ethics. It's just a form of soft, guilt-ridden exploitation. It's a new church.
Wow. Well, that was exactly what I was hoping to clarify asking this question.
Just don't study the West. Study everywhere else. And then ask people, please show me all the posts you've made on other websites about predations from other cultures. And if they haven't, it's like, well, why not? You show me the work you've done bringing Haitian slavery or Libyan slavery to light. Then if you haven't, I don't want to hear about slavery. You tell me how you're going to the Middle East or writing letters or trying to get people in the Middle East to pay reparations for the ungodly numbers of European slaves taken by force in the Middle Ages and beyond. Sex slaves, work slaves, and there's not a big white population in the Middle East, just as they took incredible numbers of slaves from Africa into the Middle East. Where's the reparations for that? It doesn't even show up on people's radar, which tells you nobody cares about this ethics. They just, you know, it's like the guy was asked, why do you rob banks? He says, because that's where the money is. Why do you push collective guilt? Well, I find the most guilty and the most rich, and I push their guilt buttons till they cough up money. It's a shakedown. And these people all claim to be so horrified at unjust exploitation. And then they hammer the white guilt of people who had nothing to do with this and verbally abuse them and shred their self-esteem and attack their culture and undermine their history. Destroy people's happiness in their own history for the sake of money, mere material money. And then they say exploitation is really, really bad, you see. Give me a fucking break.